and welcome to this workshop in which we will discuss intergenerational ministry. I'm really glad that you're here, and I look forward to being with you in a different capacity soon so that we can talk more about what each of us brings to this conversation. I fully believe that you are also an expert in this conversation and bring your own ideas and suggestions and experiences, and I look forward to sharing some of those together. By way of introduction, my name is Sara Fisher, and I currently live in Columbia, South Carolina. My spouse is an active duty Army chaplain, so he is also ordained and has standing in the Disciples of Christ, and he is a CPE supervisor in the Army, if that means anything to you, if you know what that is. We're here at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, having lived previously in Texas, Kentucky, Kansas, Washington State, Alabama, Georgia, another round here in South Carolina, and I'm from Michigan originally. So we sort of have been all over the place and have had the benefit of being in churches and in congregations in a lot of different contexts as well. I was raised as a pastor's kid in a very fundamentalist tradition. What this meant was that I grew up knowing simultaneously that there are ways I wanted to participate in the life of the church. It was our lifeblood as a family, and also had limitations placed on me not just because of my age, but because of my gender. When I was a kid, it was tradition in that church for the elementary age boys to collect offering, but the girls weren't allowed. It was the tradition for the boys to participate in worship in different ways, but not the girls. So I grew up knowing that I wanted to be a part of the life of the church and not always knowing exactly where I fit in. To my dad's credit, the older I got, he found ways to invite me to be a part of the life of the church in ways that I could be. So even when I was in high school, I sat on our church's worship planning team and missions committee. I grew up with that benefit of knowing that even as a kid and even as a teenager, I belonged at church and I was valued at church. Gender aside. And when I was in high school and college, I worked every summer at a Christian camp, and I'm passionate about camping ministry and what that can provide our kids. Though also, sometimes I'll talk more about this later. Sometimes I wonder if we put so much emphasis on camping ministry that kind of camp is what's for kids and youth, and then the rest of the year just leads up to the next summer again. So what I'm passionate about is taking kids and youth and young adults and middle-aged adults and older adults and retired people and elderly adults and everybody together as one body of Christ. I have 3 kids right now. They are 10, 12, and 14. And having watched them grow up, I have focused my ministry as both a parent and as a pastor on kids and youth being integral to the life of the church, and the life of the church being integral in the life of kids and youth. I'm going to say that one more time. Part of my philosophy of ministry is that kids are an integral part of the church, and that church is an integral part of the life of kids. Can't have one without the other. I don't believe that kids and youth in worship are to be seen and not heard. But what that looks like can mean a lot of different things. So as we get started, I want you to take a piece of paper and a pen, or open up the note app on your phone, or a new document on your laptop, or whatever is easy and convenient for you. And I have a couple of questions for you to think through, just for yourself. We don't have to talk about this later, but just think through and write down some ideas. My first question for you, and this is only for yourself to reflect on, think about the congregation that you serve or the context or community that you're a part of. What does that look like in the year 2050? What are your hopes? What are your dreams? When you imagine this group of God's beloved in 2050, 28 years from now, close your eyes and imagine yourself walking in. What does it sound like? What does it look like? What does it feel like? What does it smell like? Take just a moment and think about that and write down some reflections. Continue to think about that, as then you ask yourself, how does that vision for the year 2050 inform your ministry for the year 2022? How does that vision for the year 2050 inform your ministry for the year 2022? If you'd like to pause this video and think about that some more, that would be fine. See, I'm a big believer that what we do with children and youth isn't just to occupy them now or even to keep them wanting to come back next week, but to cultivate a life of faith and a life of belonging, a sense of belonging in the church for them, that they will be the leaders in the church in the year 2050. However you hope your church's leadership functions and the faith formation that they have in the year 2050, now is the time to start instilling that in kids and youth. I have a couple of pieces of good news. One piece of good news is that I am a very firm believer that intergenerational ministry is exactly that, because it means a lot more than children's and youth programming. This is not, I am not going to tell you how to build your children's and youth programming. That is not what I'm about. So the good news there is it doesn't matter how many kids and youth you have. If you're a small church, if you're an older church, maybe you only have kids and youth there once in a blue moon. Maybe in your congregation, the intergenerations are the working age millennials and Gen Xers and the baby boomers and silent generation. Maybe you don't even have any of the Gen Z or below. That's okay. The good news for this is whatever generations you have, you are equipped to operate, to include them all, to operate with intergenerational ministry. Another piece of good news for you today is that for all of the awful things that have come out of the last 2 years, each of us has before us now an opportunity to try things differently. No church looks today the way it did in January of 2020. No church looks today the way it did in January of 2020. Now, there's a lot of ways we could unpack that. There's a lot of gifts and limitations of all of that. But one of the realities is that if ever there was a time to try something new, to do something different, to throw it up against the wall and see what sticks, now is that time. Likely, if your church is like essentially every other church that I have talked to or been a part of, you might be having a hard time getting families to come back right now. Everybody to come back, but particularly families. I know from my own experience and also talking with colleagues and friends that families aren't coming back, at least not the way that they were before the pandemic. There's a lot of energy and time spent lamenting that, and there's a time and a place for that. But what I invite us to do instead is to pivot toward the future and say, with this as the reality, how can we respond? How can we meet the needs that exist, even if it doesn't look the way that it did 2 years ago? Part of that, I firmly believe, is building relationships within generations. And again, this is something that every single church can do. Think about your congregation right now. Maybe think about where they sit on particular pews if you're meeting in person. And think about someone in your congregation that tends younger, maybe not the youngest person, but someone, maybe even a young adult that tends on the younger side. And think about a faithful retirement age person in your congregation. Do they ever have opportunities to interact with each other? What does being the church, being the family of God, mean for those two people in relationship with each other? See, a lot of this is about kids and youth, but not all of it is. So whatever that looks like in your congregation and in your context, think about these things. When you think about intergenerational ministry, and you think about the different generations, I'm going to pause here and just talk about generations for just a brief second, because sometimes it's easy to forget who was in what generation. So as of right now, 2022, the silent generation are in their late 70s and above. Baby boomers are about mid 50s to mid 70s, give or take. Gen X is early 40s to mid 50s or so. Millennials, and again, all of this depends on exactly what year you use. So broadly speaking, I'm not going to get hooked in the details. Broadly speaking, millennials are mid 20s to late 30s, early 40s. Early 40s. I want you to hear that again. Think about what you think about when you think about millennials. Millennials are in their 20s, 30s, hitting early 40s. When you think about teenagers and college age adults, young adults, they're Gen Z. So about tweens to young 20s right now is what we call Gen Z. The kids younger than that are Gen Alpha. So my kids are 10, 12, and 14. My 10-year-old and 12-year-old are kind of right on that cusp of Gen Z and Gen Alpha. We are still learning a lot more about the characteristics, particularly of Gen Alpha. But from what I've read recently, what it looks like is Gen Alpha is taking on a lot of the characteristics of their parents, who tend to be millennials. Gen Z are the teenagers right now. We are learning more about them. One of the things that matters most to Gen Z, something that is true about them, is they grew up integrating technology into their lives. So as you think about, again, intergenerational ministry, think about the fact that there's not quite the separation for Gen Z and even young millennials of what's real life and what's online. It's all real life. So I'm going to pause for just a second. So the mail person is like parked outside my house right now, and I don't know how long they're going to be there. My dog's going to bark, so I'm sorry. That is what it is. Because life in ministry is all about adapting to what changes, right? Anyway, I say all of that to say about the generations, just to think about the generations that are in your church and what preconceptions you might have about them, and how each generation brings gifts to the table. Every generation brings gifts to the table. So think about maybe somebody representative from each one of those generations. And again, think through what opportunities do they have for relationship building within your congregation? What opportunities do they have to serve and do ministry together in your congregation? So here's some questions to ask yourself as you think about intergenerational ministry. When you think about your congregation and who's there and who's participating. Who is left out of decisions? Whether that's the decision-making process, as far as actual decision makers, or people whose needs and concerns are considered when we make decisions. Sometimes we think about that being younger kids. I'd suggest that also often means older adults. There tends to come a point where, for various reasons, adults are no longer asked to be elders or deacons. A lot of times that's for very valid reasons of health and being able to get out and having capacity to do things. But then are we still considering their concerns? What about single adults? Or maybe even people who are partnered but don't have kids? If all of the programming in your congregation for people, let's say in their 20s, 30s, and 40s is for families, how are single and childless adults being incorporated into your decision-making, and the planning of that? In a similar way, who is left out of programming? When you think about the things being offered to your church, who might not be present? Who might be left out, not because they don't want to be involved, but because the situation in their life doesn't allow for it? For example, When I was a senior pastor, we often had a difficulty choosing time for evening programming. We didn't do regular evening programming, but things like Ash Wednesday and Maundy Thursday and Christmas Eve even, things like that were difficult because we wanted the younger working age adults to come, families and other adults to come. But because we lived in a city, they often couldn't get to the church before 6:30 or 7. By the time they got off work, often drove across the city, they could not get there before 6:30 or 7. It was not a matter of whether or not they wanted to, they couldn't. Likewise, we had other adults who didn't drive at night. So if we, especially fall and spring, if we waited until 7 o'clock to start a service, those adults would not have been able to come because they didn't drive after it got dark. So there's not an easy solution there, right? But as you're making decisions around programming, are all of those things being considered? I know it's very easy to wring our hands around sports schedules and, well, the youth don't come because they're too committed to sports. What if you incorporated their schedule in a different way? What if you showed up to their events instead of bemoaning that? And again, there's a space to lament everything. But instead of only naming the problems, let's think about what opportunities for creative thinking and different ideas and different ministry there might be. And then my last question for you is, and we've already addressed it a little bit, who is left out of relationships? Who is left out of relationships? I served a fairly small congregation. We had about 40 to 50 on a Sunday morning. Of those, a good 10 to 15 were kids and youth. We had very, very few working age adults. Most of those kids and youth even came with their parents and grandparents, so very few in that 20 to 65 age range. But in my time there, we started to get more. They started to see us in the community and started to visit, but we did not have a way for them to meet and build relationships with other people in the church organically. So that is especially true when it comes to new members, but even think about the members that you have or the attenders that you have. Do they show up on Sunday morning and then that's it? I wonder what other ways of encouraging intergenerational relationships there might be. When I was a young adult in my early 20s, I dropped out of college because all I wanted was to be a wife and mom, and so I thought I didn't need a college degree. I dropped out of college and went back to my home church, not the one my dad pastored, but a different one. And the best decision I made there is that I chose, it was a larger church that had a lot of small group Bible studies, and I chose to be a part of one that was not defined by age and stage of life. Churches tend to define groups by age and stage, right? We have groups for young parents. We have groups for single people, maybe. We have groups for, senior citizens who want to get out during the day. We have groups for these age and stage defined groups of people, but we tend to not do so well at creating spaces for them to be in relationship with each other. So as we consider what church looks like in this next season and this next stage, I encourage you to focus and to spend some time and energy, maybe even with your lay leadership, thinking about these intergenerational relationships. There's a lot of different ways to go about this. I would love at some point, I was hoping to do it and then COVID happened, so we weren't able to. I would love to do an intergenerational VBS, right? Where kids come with older adults and everybody works together. One church that I pastored had a prayer partner ministry, and at that congregation they were assigned a prayer partner who was not in their family but an adult who would journey with them in kindergarten, and they stayed in relationship until 5th grade and then they did the pastor's class before baptism together, 5th-ish grade. And when I was there working with kids and youth, we expanded that program. So quarterly we did these events, they ended up being huge events where kids would come with their prayer partners and do games and activities and scavenger hunts, and they did all sorts of these things together to build relationships. It ended up being so successful, frankly, that these folks stayed in a relationship even after baptism. This program had started before I was at the church. That was not my doing. I inherited it, but it was so great at building relationships among adults and kids, not just in a teacher-student kind of way, but in an actual like living into each other's lives kind of way. In fact, my youngest, she's now 10, we left that church when she was, in preschool. Kindergarten? No, first grade. We left that church when she was in first grade. So she had only had that prayer partner for a year. That prayer partner still reaches out on her birthday and throughout the year to check in on her and just be a loving adult in her life. And I think that's amazing. What would it be like to partner up someone in their 20s with someone in their 50s? Not necessarily in any like mentoring kind of way. That might be a part of it. But just it to maybe get together for coffee once a quarter. Or have other events in the church, maybe even that help them get to know each other better. One of the things that we are learning more and more is that the folks who are most likely to come back to church is the folks that feel the most ownership and the most relationship, that it matters that they're there, that they look forward to it because it is life-giving to be there. It's not consumeristic. It's not a check the block and then we'll go on with our week. But that, again, church is integral in the lives of everyone in the congregation, and that everyone in the congregation is integral to the life of the church. I'm going to pause there and give you just a moment to kind of digest all of these things that I've been saying before we move on. If you want to move your neck around, look to the right, look to the left, look up, look down. I have read, there's a book called Sticky Faith that I would highly recommend. This book talks about how in order for kids to feel like they belong in church, to feel a sense of belongingness, that they need 4 to 5 non-family adults who know them, who know them well enough to know what's going on in their lives, to ask questions, to have conversations with them. It doesn't need to be intimate or, anything big or important, but around, consider if you're doing fellowship, or maybe before COVID you did fellowship over donuts or cookies or coffee or something. Do you ever notice the adults and the kids or the teenagers mingling with each other? Or do people tend to stay in pockets of people they already know? It's one example. Again, I have some other ideas and some other resources of ways to do this, but I just want to get you thinking about what possibilities there could be to do this well. So now let's talk for just a moment specifically about worship, because we have a tendency to not do a great job incorporating kids and youth into worship. Other than Youth Sunday, when is the last time you remember seeing a kid or a teenager on the platform of your church? When they were, was it a performance or was it leading in worship? That's a little bit tricky. And I'm not saying that performance is not leading in worship ever. I do know that even when I was a kid, I felt dismissed and trivialized when the children's choir would get up to sing and then everyone would clap. But they never clapped for the adult choir. Now, I'm not saying I don't think we should clap in worship. People have very strong feelings about that. I'm not getting into that. Do what you want to do. What I am saying is if any time that kids are on the platform, it's kind of with a oh, they're so cute. This might be a good time to introduce kids doing other things, whether that is leading a call to worship or reading scripture. Teenagers doing reader's theater for long passages of the text is phenomenal. Are there other ways that your kids could run the social media for your congregation? That they could run the sound, the tech for your congregation? Or maybe you go to them and say, hey, we notice you're here every week. We'd love for you to be involved. What is something that you would like to do? We often don't give kids and youth the agency and the respect of deciding those things for themselves. Maybe that's a place to start. When I was in seminary, I took a class about theology and disability and incorporating every person into our worship regardless of ability level. And one of the concepts that we studied in that class is actually an architectural concept called universal design. So think for a second if you've been in a house that maybe was built in the 1970s. I have lived in houses built in the 1970s, and those houses all have like 2 or 3 steps here and there, right? We lived in a house in Kentucky that had, you would walk up a couple of stairs to the entryway, and then it was like 2 more steps up, and then you would go through the kitchen, and there was like 2 more steps down into a different room, or you could go up another like half flight of stairs to another room. And in the 70s, that was a very common design, that there were kind of like stairs everywhere. But what we are learning, and what we have learned, is that universal design means what is more accessible for one group of people is more accessible for everyone. In other words, if someone who uses a wheelchair came into my house, and I have a sister-in-law, a close family member who does use a wheelchair, and when we have lived in houses with those 2 or 3 steps here and there, she couldn't get around. But when architects started designing buildings on one level, it was easier for people who use wheelchairs. It was easier for people with other mobility issues. It was easier for toddlers who can't walk up and down steps so easily. It was easier for teenagers who had broken their leg playing a sport and were on crutches. It was easier for people who had raised a family in that house or had an entire career in that house and then got older and couldn't move up and down stairs so much anymore. The idea is that when you think about the needs of a group of people that might have more needs, and we aim to meet those needs, that it will actually end up benefiting a much larger group of people. I hope that makes sense. Think also about doorknobs. The newer style doorknobs, you can just push the knob down and push in, is a lot easier for a lot of people to do, whether it's because they have arthritic hands or whatever other things might be going on. So consider applying that same principle to worship. When I talk about incorporating kids and youth and the elderly and single adults and working adults and people with disabilities and any other of God's beloved into worship, I don't mean making it for kids in such a way that every Sunday feels like VBS Sunday. What I mean is, when you think about worship, think about what your worship service feels like from different perspectives. Maybe even imagine different people, here's my dog again. Imagine different people sitting in your pews and what they might experience on a Sunday. Think about the examples, the sermon illustrations that are used. Are those only applicable to working adults? Are they only applicable to people with families? Those are some examples of ways that simply by using an example that talks about the playground instead of the employee lounge, you could take the same story but make it more accessible for younger kids. Again, we can talk more in detail about some different ideas and suggestions and resources of things that we have seen done well, but I do want you to think about your worship service, and maybe it's online, and what is that like for different people? Think about your worship service in person. Think about your programming. Think about your decision making. Think about relationships. How are each one of these generations included? How are each one of these generations valued? How are each one of these generations given dignity and respect and agency? How do each one of these generations experience God's love for them and God's love for the world? There are so many ways we can do this, and small churches are just as equipped as large churches. Again, I want to remind you that it is not just about having large children's programming or a big youth group. If you only have 2 or 3 kids in worship on a Sunday, then involve them in whatever ways they want to be, right? Whether that's on the platform, whether that's passing out bulletins, whether that's drawing the artwork for next week's bulletin. You know, if they don't want to be on the platform, I recognize not everybody does. There's ways to include and incorporate everybody. And by doing that, by including and incorporating and valuing kids while they're kids, They grow up knowing how to lead in church. The only way, or maybe the best way for young adults to have the confidence to speak from the platform, to do a call to worship, is to teach them how to do that when they're kids. They grow up with it being normal and normative. So think about that. Think about how church might be experienced by a third grader or a 30-year-old or a 90-year-old. Think about how we are equipping and training this generation of young people to lead the church into what is next. Just as the church is not today what it was 2 years ago, the church is not today what it was 20 years ago, and it never will be again. And the church of 20 years from now, the church of 28 years from now in 2050 will not look like the church of today. So how are we raising our kids and our youth to prepare them to lead the church into this next generation, to respond to the ways God is working in the world so that they can take the love of God into the world around them, into the community? How are we showing them, not just telling them, but showing them that it's important, that part of being a part of a body of faith is showing up for each other, for caring for each other, for cheering each other on, and for crying with each other? I will see you very soon as we will talk more about some of these ideas, and I look forward to hearing yours as well.